Josh Kroenke is on the phone personally, not an agent, not a sporting director. The owner himself, stepping directly into a negotiation that had stalled and turned tense. On one end of that conversation is Aston Villa, a club that felt insulted by an opening offer. On the other end is a defensive crisis at Arsenal that cannot wait. William Saliba is out with a back injury, and the club needs a Premier League-proven centre-back in the building before this window closes. This is not a story about a routine signing. This is a story about an owner going over the head of his own sporting director to get a deal unstuck, at a moment when patience had already run out. Ezri Konsa is the man in the middle of it, and for weeks the numbers simply refused to align. Aston Villa wanted £60 million. Arsenal wanted something closer to £35 million. That gap is not small. That gap is the kind of gap that kills deals in late August. And underneath the pure economics sat something more personal. Something rooted in an approach for Ollie Watkins back in January of 2025 that Aston Villa never forgot and never forgave. Here is what was genuinely at risk. If this deal collapsed, Arsenal would enter the final stretch of the transfer window with a backline short of proven Premier League cover, precisely when their first-choice centre-back was already sidelined. Mikel Arteta had already looked elsewhere. Ezri Konsa was considered. Cristian Romero was considered. Neither materialised into what Konsa represented, which is why the club kept circling back to the Aston Villa defender, even as the relationship between the two boardrooms grew colder. There is also a reputational dimension here that cannot be ignored. Reports indicate that Andrea Berta himself had become, in the words used to describe the situation, an issue in these negotiations. That is a serious claim about the man running Arsenal's transfer strategy. If the sporting director cannot smooth a deal for a defender the club has wanted for months, that raises real questions about execution, not recruitment. The vision was right. The path to get there was breaking down. If you want the kind of analysis that goes past the headlines and actually explains why deals stall, why owners get personally involved, and what it means for how a football club is being run behind the scenes, this is exactly the channel for that. Hit that subscribe button now, because we are about to go step by step through everything confirmed and everything still rumoured in this Arsenal window, and there is a lot to get through. Let's start with what is now fully confirmed. Arsenal have agreed a deal to sign Ezri Konsa from Aston Villa. The fee is understood to be £50 million plus add-ons, and a long-term contract is already in place with the England international. His medical is scheduled to take place within 48 hours of the agreement being reached, meaning this is not speculation anymore. This is a done deal awaiting the final formality of a medical examination. What stands out to me is not just that the fee landed at £50 million, sitting almost exactly between Aston Villa's £60 million valuation and Arsenal's original £35 million offer. What stands out is how it got there. Konsa himself actively pushed for the move. He made clear his desire to come to the Premier League champions. That matters enormously in modern football, because a player who wants the move tends to apply quiet pressure on his own club to be reasonable. But even with the player pulling in one direction, the two boardrooms needed an external force to actually close the gap. And that force was Josh Kroenke stepping in personally to manage the tension between the clubs. I want to be precise about where that tension came from, because it is not simply about money. The Ollie Watkins saga from January of 2025 left real animosity behind. Arsenal's approach for the Aston Villa striker at that time did not land well, and it appears that wound never fully healed. Layer on top of that Aston Villa's belief that Arsenal's initial approach for Konsa was insulting, and you can see exactly why this deal needed an intervention rather than a normal negotiation process. Andrea Berta being described as an issue in these talks is a detail I think deserves real scrutiny. Whatever the exact nature of that friction, it was significant enough that the ownership felt it necessary to bypass the usual channel and deal with Aston Villa directly. Now let's talk about why Arsenal wanted Konsa so badly in the first place, because the data supports the pursuit. Ezri Konsa posted the highest pass completion rate under high-intensity pressure of any player in the Premier League last season, among players with a minimum of 100 pass attempts, at 92.5%. That is not a marginal statistic. That is elite composure on the ball under duress, which is precisely the profile Arteta wants in a back line that is expected to play out from the back under pressure from opposition presses. Alongside that, recent data shows Konsa topping the league for ground duel success rate in the 2025-2026 season at 73.1%, ahead of players like Virgil van Dijk, Arsenal's own Gabriel, Sven Botman, and Joel Veltman. When you combine ball retention under pressure with dual dominance, you are looking at a defender who checks both the modern possession box and the traditional defensive box. This is not a panic buy forced by an injury. This is a targeted signing that happens to be arriving at a moment of genuine need. There is also a human element worth including here. Bukayo Saka has previously spoken about doing 1-versus-1 training sessions with Konsa, describing him as one of the best in the Premier League at defending in isolation. When a player of Saka's caliber, someone who faces elite defenders in training and in matches constantly, singles out a specific opponent as uniquely difficult to beat in a 1-versus-1 situation, that is a meaningful piece of testimony about Konsa's individual quality. It reinforces everything the statistics are telling us. So where does that leave Arsenal's defensive picture? With Saliba sidelined by a back injury, the timing of this signing becomes even more significant. Arsenal are effectively bringing in Premier League proven cover at the exact moment their first-choice partner alongside Gabriel is unavailable. The urgency explains why the club were willing to pay more than they originally wanted. The need had become, in the words used to describe it, a matter of urgency. And credit where it is due, once Kroenke intervened personally, the deal that had stalled for weeks came together within a matter of hours. Now I want to shift to the other side of Arsenal's summer, because signings only tell half the story. The outgoing business at this club has been a persistent weakness, and this window is proving no different. So far, only Leandro Trossard and Christian Norgard have actually been sold. That is it. 2 departures, against a backdrop of a club that spent well over £1 billion and now needs to balance the books through sales that simply are not happening at the pace required. Let's talk about Gabriel Martinelli first, because his situation is genuinely fluid right now. There is a very real chance he could be sold before this window shuts. He was left out of the Community Shield squad against Manchester City, alongside Gabriel Jesus and Ethan Nwaneri, and being omitted from a squad for a fixture of that magnitude is widely read as a signal that a player is considered surplus to requirements. I want to be clear that nothing about a Martinelli exit is confirmed. This remains speculation. But the door does appear to be open, particularly because Arsenal are looking to bring in another left winger, which would naturally push Martinelli further down the pecking order. Here is where it gets interesting from an analytical perspective. Unai Emery, now at Aston Villa, has a very specific history with Martinelli. When Martinelli first arrived at Arsenal, he was primarily used as a striker under Emery, having made his name as a centre-forward at Ituano in Brazil. That decision worked. Under Emery, Martinelli started 6 matches as a striker and scored 7 goals in that role, including braces against Nottingham Forest and Standard Liège, and a particularly memorable goal against Liverpool at Anfield. That is a real, established track record of a manager getting genuine centre-forward output from a player usually deployed as a winger. So when Aston Villa are exploring replacements for Ollie Watkins, who is reportedly attracting interest from Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia, Martinelli becomes a name that makes obvious sense given that specific history with Emery. I want to stress again that this is speculation at this stage, not an agreed deal, but the logic behind the links is sound, given what we already know about how Emery has used Martinelli before. It is also worth noting that Martinelli previously turned down an approach from Galatasaray, which tells you something about his ambitions. He does not appear willing to leave the Premier League or step down in competitive level, which actually strengthens the logic of an Aston Villa move over other reported interest, since it would keep him in England's top flight. Now to Gabriel Jesus, and this is where Arsenal's outgoing plan is hitting real turbulence. Jesus is currently not open to a proposed move to Napoli, despite what has been described as a good relationship between the Italian club and Arsenal. He is reportedly taking his time to fully understand what is the best solution for his future. From a pure football logic standpoint, this looks like an unusual hesitation, because Napoli represents a genuine opportunity for regular football. At Arsenal, Jesus currently sits behind Kai Havertz, Victor Gyökeres and Mikel Merino in the striker pecking order. He is effectively the 4th-choice centre-forward at a club competing on every front. Serie A's pace and tactical style, generally slower and more structured than the Premier League, would suit a player who has spent recent seasons battling fitness issues and struggling for consistent minutes. But Jesus, by his own hesitation, does not seem to see it the same way. It is entirely reasonable to read this as a player who wants guaranteed starts, rather than another supporting role, even in a league that suits his attributes. And for a player who has fought through multiple injury setbacks over the past several seasons, the desire to actually play regularly, rather than compete for occasional minutes, is completely understandable from a human standpoint. The financial pressure on this situation is significant. Jesus earns £265,000 a week. If Arsenal want to bring in another attacker before the window closes, that salary almost certainly needs to come off the wage bill first. Arsenal are expected to recoup somewhere in the region of £15 million for the striker, a modest figure relative to his wages, which underlines that this is now as much about financial flexibility as it is about football logic. With Napoli reportedly already exploring alternatives, including Joshua Zirkzee at Manchester United and Nicholas Jackson at Chelsea, there is a real risk that this specific opportunity for Jesus could disappear if he continues to delay a decision. And Jesus is not the only stalled sale. Fabio Vieira's move to Hamburg is still dragging on without resolution, and Reiss Nelson remains without a confirmed buyer, despite known interest from West Ham United. Put all of this together and you get a clear picture. The sales plan that was supposed to help fund Arsenal's remaining business this summer is moving far slower than hoped. 2 confirmed departures in Trossard and Norgard against 3 separate situations, Martinelli, Jesus and Vieira, that remain unresolved, plus Nelson still without a taker. That is a genuine structural problem for how this window closes out, even as the club continues chasing incoming reinforcements. Now let's move through the wider information circulating around the club, and I want to be very clear about separating what is confirmed from what is pure speculation, because the gap between the two matters enormously. Starting with Kenan Yildiz. Juventus head coach Luciano Spalletti has directly addressed reports linking the young forward with Arsenal. His words were measured but firm. He acknowledged the speculation exists, called Yildiz important for Juventus, and said interest in a player of his quality is natural. But he was equally clear that Yildiz remains a Juventus player, that the priority is his development at the club, and that any decision about his future rests with the club, not with speculation. My read on this is straightforward. This is a manager doing exactly what managers do when a valuable young player is being linked elsewhere, protecting the player's focus publicly, while not shutting the door entirely on a future scenario. This remains firmly in rumour territory, and nothing here suggests an actual move is close. Next, Julian Alvarez. There are reports suggesting Atletico Madrid are now considering selling the Argentine forward to Arsenal in a package worth around €120 million, including add-ons, with claims that Mikel Arteta has spoken directly with Alvarez to try to convince him to make the move. It is also being suggested that Atletico have effectively ruled out selling to Barcelona unless a huge €170 million valuation is met, which would make an Arsenal deal comparatively more realistic. I want to flag this clearly as unverified speculation circulating on social media, rather than a confirmed transfer situation. The gap between a €120 million figure to one club and a €170 million figure to a rival is a significant discrepancy that alone should make viewers treat this with real caution until it comes from a more established reporting line. On Ethan Nwaneri, the picture is more settled, at least in terms of intention. Arsenal are reportedly focused on finding him the right loan move and have no intention of selling him outright. The stated belief is that regular first-team football elsewhere would significantly benefit his development at this stage of his career. Given that this aligns with typical pathway planning for a highly rated academy talent, and given that it comes through BBC Sport as the underlying source, I would treat the loan intention as considerably more credible than the outright sale rumours attached to other players in this squad. It also fits neatly with him being left out of the Community Shield squad, not because he is being frozen out permanently, but because a temporary pathway elsewhere is being planned for him. There is also a piece of context worth adding here regarding Bukayo Saka. In a resurfaced comment from June of 2024, Saka described doing 1-versus-1 training sessions with Ezri Konsa and called him one of the best in the Premier League at defending in isolation. I referenced this earlier when breaking down the Konsa signing, but it is worth restating in this section because it shows that Arsenal's interest in Konsa was not a sudden reaction to Saliba's injury. Players inside the camp were already aware of his quality well over a year before the transfer materialised. Now to Victor Gyökeres, and this is one of the more surprising threads circulating right now. There are reports suggesting the striker is offering himself to Barcelona and wants to leave Arsenal, with his agent reportedly seeking a meeting with Deco, who apparently did not previously view him as an option. The suggestion is that the situation could now be activated given the striker's own desire to leave. I want to treat this with real caution. This is exactly the kind of story that needs verified reporting before it should be taken as anything more than speculation. If accurate, it would represent a significant shift, given Gyökeres currently sits ahead of Gabriel Jesus in the striker pecking order at Arsenal. But until this is confirmed through more established transfer reporting, this remains firmly a rumour, and I would encourage caution before treating it as fact. On the positive and confirmed side of things, there is a genuinely warm story involving a new signing. Bruno Guimaraes was greeted enthusiastically by supporters at an Arsenal Supporters Trust event at the Emirates, with fans chanting his name. He addressed the crowd directly, saying he hopes the club can make history together, and describing himself as a warrior who wants to give his best for the supporters. This is the kind of moment that tells you a great deal about early sentiment around a new arrival. The reception was clearly positive, and his own words suggest genuine motivation rather than a rehearsed soundbite. Good engagement between new signings and supporter groups early in a tenure tends to set a healthy tone for how a player settles into a dressing room and a fan base. There is also a good piece of managerial insight from Mikel Arteta himself, discussing the strange experience of not facing Pep Guardiola this season. He described it as strange, but also as an absolute joy, explaining that competing against Guardiola forced him to elevate his own level, and crediting Guardiola with setting a standard in the Premier League that had not been seen before. I find this comment particularly revealing about Arteta as a competitor. Managers rarely credit a direct rival this openly, and the fact that Arteta frames the absence of that rivalry as something notable, even a little strange, suggests just how much that specific competitive relationship shaped his own development as a head coach. Finally, two reflective comments from Eberechi Eze that give real insight into the psychology behind Arsenal's recent title-winning campaign. On Declan Rice's leadership, Eze described the moment after a loss to Manchester City when Rice declared it is not done. Eze recalled the energy in the changing room afterward, describing it as a genuine confidence that the team was going to achieve what they set out to achieve, and he credited Rice's mentality with rubbing off on a lot of the squad. Separately, Eze spoke about his own personal belief that Arsenal were going to win the title, describing it as simply how he is wired, rooted in faith and confidence in the group and the position the team was in. Taken together, these two comments paint a clear picture of a dressing room that leaned heavily on internal belief and senior leadership during moments of genuine pressure, particularly after a result that could easily have knocked confidence rather than strengthened it. So where does all of this leave Arsenal as this window moves toward its conclusion? On the incoming side, the picture is strong and increasingly settled. Ezri Konsa represents a confirmed, well-reasoned signing that directly addresses a defensive need created by Saliba's injury, backed by genuinely elite underlying data on pressure resistance and dual success. Bruno Guimaraes has already arrived and is being welcomed warmly by supporters. Beyond that, the picture becomes speculative, with Julian Alvarez and Kenan Yildiz representing longer shots that require significantly more verification before being treated as likely outcomes. On the outgoing side, the picture is far less settled and represents the real pressure point of this window. Only two departures are confirmed, Trossard and Norgard, while Gabriel Martinelli's future remains genuinely open given his omission from the Community Shield squad and Aston Villa's specific history with him under Emery. Gabriel Jesus' hesitation over a Napoli move threatens to derail a sale that made obvious sense on paper, and the clock is very much ticking given that alternative targets are already being explored elsewhere. Fabio Vieira and Reiss Nelson remain unresolved. And now, adding a further layer of uncertainty, there are unconfirmed reports suggesting even Victor Gyökeres may be exploring an exit of his own. What this window ultimately comes down to is a familiar tension for this Arsenal side. The recruitment vision, when it comes to targeting the right players for the right needs, continues to look sharp, as the Konsa signing demonstrates clearly. But turning that vision into completed business, particularly on the outgoing side, remains the persistent challenge. Josh Kroenke had to step in personally to get one deal over the line. Whether similar intervention proves necessary to resolve the situation still hanging over Martinelli, Jesus, Vieira and Nelson before this window closes remains to be seen. That is where things stand right now. Confirmed business, genuine speculation, and a defined list of situations still needing resolution before the deadline arrives. Make sure you are subscribed for the next update, because with 13 days still on the clock for Arsenal to untangle their outgoing situation, there is a great deal still to come before this window shuts for good.